5 o'clock in the morning, 7th of August, 1944. A sunken lane north of Mortain, Normandy, hemmed in on both sides by earthen hedgerow banks 4 feet high and thick with hawthorn. Mist sits low in the fields, the kind that clings to boots and muffles sound. A gun crew of the 120th Infantry Regiment lies flat behind a 57mm anti-tank gun, its long barrel angled through a gap cut in the bank, camouflaged with cut branches. Nobody speaks. Somewhere down the lane, beyond a bend where the road drops towards the little crossroads at L'Abbaye Blanche, an engine turns over. Then another. The sergeant commanding the gun, Miller Rhine, presses his palm flat against the earth and feels it tremble before he hears anything at all. A runner from the platoon command post has already told him what is coming. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, pushing north out of the town they captured hours earlier, aiming to smash the American line and reopen the road to Avranches. The crew has one gun, a handful of rounds stacked within reach, and roughly 4 feet of hedgerow between themselves and whatever rolls around that bend. The mist has not yet burned off. Somewhere behind them, a Cistercian priory, older than the United States itself, stands watch over the crossroads that is about to become a slaughtering ground for German armour. What happens in the next few minutes will be recounted, argued over and mythologized for decades, because in the space of little over a minute, at murderously close range, this hidden crew and the men beside them will turn a narrow farm lane into one of the most lopsided tank-killing grounds of the entire Normandy campaign. To understand why a single gun crew crouched in a Norman hedgerow mattered so much, one has to understand the crisis gripping the German High Command that first week of August 1944. 6 weeks after the Allied landings, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army had broken out of the Cotentin Peninsula through the gap at Avranches, and by August 1st his tanks were pouring south and east into open country, threatening to unravel the entire German position in France. Adolf Hitler, from his headquarters in East Prussia, ordered a counterstroke that defied the advice of his own generals. 4 Panzer divisions, roughly 300 tanks, and 26,000 men would drive west through the town of Mortain to Avranches, severing Patton's supply lines and trapping his spearheads. The operation was codenamed Luttich. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the west, considered it reckless. He carried it out anyway. Standing directly in the German path was the American 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory, a National Guard formation drawn from North Carolina, South Carolina and Tennessee that had already bled through the hedgerow fighting around St. Lo. Mortain itself had only been captured by the Americans on the 3rd of August, and the relieving 30th Division had barely settled into its positions before the German build-up began. The Americans' principal anti-tank weapon at platoon level was the M157mm gun, a scaled-up derivative of the British 6-pounder, firing a shell that could punch through 68mm of armour at close range. Against the sloped 80mm glacis plate of a Panther fired head-on, it was next to useless. Fired into a Panther's thinner side or rear plating at a range measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, it was a different weapon altogether. That distinction between frontal futility and flank lethality would decide what happened in the bocage over the following 72 hours. The German plan called for 6 armoured columns to converge on Mortain and push west. Only 3 moved on schedule. The 2nd S Panzer Division struck directly through the town before dawn on the 7th of August, guided in part by 2 French collaborators who talked their way past an American checkpoint before a hidden German machine gun crew opened fire on the sentries. Further north, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte and the 2nd Panzer Division pushed towards Saint-Barthélemy, while the 116th Panzer Division, tasked with the northern flank, barely moved at all. At the crossroads north of Mortain, known as L'Abbaye Blanche, named for the old Cistercian convent standing beside the road, 2 platoons of Company F, 120th Infantry, together with a platoon from the regiment's anti-tank company and a platoon of 3-inch towed tank destroyers from Company A, 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, had dug in the previous afternoon under Lieutenant Tom Andrews. Their position covered a stone bridge over the River Cants and the junction of 2 roads the German columns needed to reach Avranches. By first light, they had assembled 4 3-inch guns, at least 1 57mm gun, bazooka teams, a pair of flamethrowers, and several machine gun positions, all sighted into the hedgerow banks, so that approaching vehicles would be committed to the lane before a single American weapon fired. 66 men held that crossroads. Some had been in Normandy since the 2nd week of the invasion and knew exactly how bocage terrain punished the unwary. At around 5 in the morning, the leading elements of Das Reichs der Führer Regiment came down the road towards the bridge, reconnaissance vehicles and half-tracks first, feeling for the American line in the last of the fog. The gunners at L'Abbaye Blanche let them close before opening fire, and within moments the leading vehicles were burning in the roadway, blocking the lane behind them and turning the approach into a killing funnel for whatever followed. It was here, in that first violent exchange, that Sergeant Rhine's 57mm crew and the tank destroyer teams alongside it caught a trio of German armoured vehicles pushing up in close order, unable to turn or reverse in the confined lane, unable to bring their frontal armour to bear before the guns hidden in the bank found their flanks. In under 2 minutes, 3 of the leading vehicles were disabled or burning, their crews bailing out into ditches already swept by American machine gun fire. It was exactly the scenario the 57mm gun had been designed to exploit, and almost never got the chance to. Point-blank range, side armour exposed, no room for the German columns to manoeuvre around the obstruction. Further along the same road that morning, other guns from the roadblock and from the 120th Anti-Tank Company would go on to account for more than 60 enemy vehicles, hub to hub, before the fighting at Mortain was over. A running toll that included half-tracks, self-propelled guns, reconnaissance cars, and tanks. But it was the ambush in that first grey hour at the narrowest stretch of the lane that broke the momentum of the German column and left it fighting for a crossroads it could no longer simply drive through. The German soldiers advancing that morning were not green troops. Das Reich had fought its way across southern France before Normandy and through the hedgerow country around Saint-Lô, and its officers understood bocage warfare as well as any American platoon leader. What they had not accounted for was a crossroads defended in depth, with tank destroyers sighted to cover ground the 57mm gun alone could not, machine guns positioned to cut down crews trying to abandon burning vehicles, and infantry close enough to use bazookas on anything that survived the guns. A German panzer crew inside a Panther trusted in armour that could shrug off a 57mm round from the front, and that trust was not misplaced on open ground.
In a lane 4 feet wide, boxed in by earth banks and unable to traverse a turret without striking hedgerow on either side, the same tank became a target no different from a lorry. Prisoners taken later that day told interrogators they had believed the road north was lightly held, based on aerial reconnaissance that had failed to spot guns dug into the banks and covered with cut branches. That single misjudgment, repeated up and down the German chain of command that week, cost Das Reich dearly at the one crossroads it most needed to control. While the fight raged at L'Abbaye Blanche, other elements of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, found themselves cut off entirely on high ground east of Mortain that the GIs called Hill 314, roughly 314 meters above sea level. Some 700 men under the senior surviving officer, Captain Reynold Eriksson, were surrounded within hours of the German assault and would hold that position for 5 days with dwindling ammunition and almost no food or water. 2 forward observers from the 231st Field Artillery Battalion, Lieutenants Charles Bartz and Robert Weiss, discovered they had an unobstructed view of the roads below and began radioing coordinates for American artillery with an accuracy that shattered German columns queuing to pass beneath the hill. If this deep dive into history interests you, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think. North of the town at Saint Barthélemy, the picture looked very different again. There, Panthers and Mark IVs of the 1st SS Panzer Division's Tank Battalion, delayed by the same fog and the cramped assembly areas that had hampered the whole operation, finally moved forward around 4:30 that morning. American forward positions there fought with what they had, but the fighting was far more punishing for the defenders than at L'Abbaye Blanche. 6 tank destroyers and 3 infantry 57mm guns were lost in the sector during the morning's fighting, a reminder that hedgerow ambushes worked brilliantly when terrain and timing favored the defender, and could just as easily fail when it did not. The contrast between the 2 roadblocks, one crossroads holding through concealment and confined ground, another position being overrun in open fog-bound country, illustrates how thin the margin was between triumph and disaster in the bocage. Civilians caught between the lines fared worse than either side's soldiers. Families in Mortain who had cheered American liberators with flowers only 4 days earlier now hid in cellars as German infantry kicked in doors and searched houses street by street, while further out in the farmland surrounding Saint-Barthélemy and Le Mesnil-Adelais, whole families abandoned farmhouses that stood directly in the path of advancing panzer columns, taking what livestock and belongings they could move on foot. By the afternoon of August 7th, American commanders had grasped something crucial. The German attack, so alarming on paper with 4 panzer divisions committed, was stalling in front of dug-in infantry and anti-tank guns sighted with real skill into hedgerow country the Germans themselves had once used to slow the American advance. Encouraged by clearing skies, the 9th Air Force and the RAF flew hundreds of sorties against the stalled columns that afternoon, rocket-firing Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts hunting German armor trapped nose to tail on narrow Norman roads. General Omar Bradley, receiving reports from the front, recognized the wider opportunity. If von Kluge kept feeding divisions into a battle he was losing around Mortain, those same divisions would still be west of the Seine when Allied forces closed the ring further east near Falaise and Argentan, a trap that would eventually consume most of what remained of German armored strength in Normandy. The realization that changed the shape of the whole campaign did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but through a string of decisions made under pressure over 7th and 8th August. Von Kluge, watching his armored spearheads bleed out against roadblocks like L'Abbaye Blanche and against artillery directed from Hill 314, requested permission to disengage. Hitler refused and instead ordered the attack renewed with even greater force. a decision that historians have since treated as one of the clearest examples of strategic misjudgment in the entire Normandy campaign. American commanders, meanwhile, made the opposite calculation. Rather than reinforce Mortain heavily and risk diluting the forces needed to close the Falaise Gap, they held the line with what the 30th Division already had, backed by artillery and air power, and let the German attack exhaust itself against fixed defenses. It was a calculated gamble that the infantry and gun crews on the ground, men like Rhine's crew in their Hedgerow, would hold long enough for the trap further east to close. American engineers and supply units faced their own version of the crisis that week. With the main road through Mortain cut and fighting continuing around L'Abbaye Blanche, ammunition and rations for the men on Hill 314 had to be dropped by parachute from P-47 Thunderbolts flying low over the surrounded companies, a resupply method the 9th Air Force had not used at this scale before, and refined under fire, with roughly 40% of the drops landing close enough for the infantry to retrieve. Medical officers on the hill ran out of morphine within the first 2 days and improvised with whatever captured German supplies came to hand after a nearby skirmish. Down at the roadblock, by contrast, resupply proved almost straightforward once the initial ambush had cleared the lane, since the destroyed vehicles blocking the road also prevented any fresh German attempt to force the crossing until engineers and infantry could clear a bypass through the fields. That single tactical fact, a jammed roadway acting as its own obstacle, shaped the whole second day of fighting at L'Abbaye Blanche and bought the defenders time they would not otherwise have had. The German offensive was effectively broken by August 10th, though fighting around Mortain and Hill 314 continued until the encircled companies were finally relieved on August 12th. 400 of the roughly 700 men who had held the hill were killed or wounded during those 5 days, a casualty rate above 50% that testified to how close the German effort had come to succeeding. Operation Luttich cost the German army in the region of 9,000 casualties and, more critically, stripped the last significant reserve of armor that might otherwise have covered a fighting withdrawal towards the Seine. Instead, the divisions that had attacked Mortain, Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and the Leibstandarte found themselves funneled directly into the closing jaws of the Falaise Pocket over the following fortnight, where thousands more Germans and hundreds more vehicles were destroyed from the air and on the ground in scenes even more catastrophic than the roads north of Mortain. Return for a moment to that hedgerow lane. By the evening of the 7th of August, the fog had long since burned away, and the crossroads at L'Abbaye Blanche, so quiet at 5 that morning, was littered with the blackened hulks of German vehicles, more than 60 of them by the time the fighting at Mortain finally ended, sitting nose to tail exactly where the terrain had trapped them. Sergeant Rhine's gun crew, along with the tank destroyer teams and riflemen who had held that junction, received no ceremony that night, only fresh ammunition brought up under cover of darkness and orders to hold the position for whatever the Germans tried next. The old Cistercian priory beside the road, standing since the 12th century, had watched armies pass before and would watch this one broken in the fields around it. What the hidden crew in that Norman hedgerow proved, in roughly a minute of violence at first light, was that a weapon written off as obsolete against the finest tank in the German arsenal could still decide a battle, provided it was placed by men who understood the ground, waited for the range to close, and did not fire until the enemy had nowhere left to turn.